Good evening. My name is Rosa Murray and I'm a member of the core group of the Scottish Laity Network, and it's my privilege to host the first session of our Advent journey, which will take place over the next 3 weeks. Before introducing our guest companion for tonight's session, I'd like to share a wee bit of the background to our journey. The overall theme, forced like Jesus Christ to flee, was the one chosen by Pope Francis for this year's 106th World Day of Migrants and Refugees. And in his message for that day, he said,
"When we talk about migrants and displaced persons, all too often we stop at statistics. But it's not about statistics, it's about real people. If we encounter them, we'll get to know more about them. And knowing their stories, we'll be able to understand them."
Our Advent journey presents us with an opportunity to listen, to engage in conversation, and pray that despite the dark clouds over a closed world, we, through the inspiration of the Spirit, may find new paths of hope. As is our custom, we begin with a short time of prayer. We begin by recalling the first pastoral visit outside of Rome that Pope Francis made in July 2013, when he went to the island of Lampedusa as a gesture of solidarity with the thousands of migrants who had travelled there from Africa, seeking a gateway to Europe. He made them visible to the rest of us in the world. At the heart of his homily was the issue of the globalization of indifference.
The culture of comfort, which makes us think only of ourselves, makes us insensitive to the cries of other people, makes us live in soap bubbles which, however lovely, are insubstantial. They offer a fleeting and empty illusion which results in indifference to others. Indeed, it even leads to the globalization of indifference. In this globalized world, we have fallen into globalized indifference. We have become used to the suffering of others. It doesn't affect me. It doesn't concern me. It's none of my business. We are a society which has forgotten how to weep, how to experience compassion, suffering with others. The globalization of indifference has taken from us the ability to weep.
Sometimes, however, global indifference is challenged and rocked to its core. This happened in September 2015, when the full horror of the human tragedy unfolding on the shores of Europe was revealed in the image of the 3-year-old boy Alan Kurdi, lying face down in the surf, having been washed up on a beach in Turkey. The other image that went viral at that time was that of the grim-faced policeman carrying Alan's tiny body away. Let's now spend some time in silence, praying, possibly weeping. Let us now pray that on our Advent journey, the Spirit will purge us of any indifference, that we may weep with and for our sisters and brothers, and that we may resolve to act in solidarity with and for them. Okay, it's now my pleasure to introduce a dear friend, someone I've worked with before and known over many years, Alison Phipps. Alison holds the UNESCO Chair in Refugee Integration through Languages and the Arts at the University of Glasgow, where she is also Professor of Languages and Intercultural Studies and co-convener of Glasgow Refugee Asylum and Migration Network, GRAMNet. She is also a relentless worker, advocate on behalf of those whose voices cannot be heard or who are invisible. Alison, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I bring you greetings and blessings from the Iona community, of which I'm also a member, who are delighted that I've been able to be with you tonight for this start of Advent and an Advent journey. I'd like to just begin with a poem which I wrote for my friend Pinar Aksu. Pinar is an advocate for refugee justice who experienced detention in the United Kingdom as a child, and who, after she'd been released and granted refugee status and had become a UK citizen, has continued to use her experience to advocate for justice and freedom for all refugees. And she spent time on the island of Lesbos. Rosa was just speaking of Lampedusa, and she spent time on Lesbos in 2015, which is a pivotal time for us to think of as we contemplate what it means to come out of those icy waters, if you come out at all. And Pinar told me a story, and I turned it into this poem. And she told me the story as she gave me a pebble. And I still have the pebble and hold the pebble, but it's in my office, so I don't have it to hand at home. And this is the story for Pinar: a pebble, a stone with a story. Here were hands, first clutching at waves, clutching at air, then clutching at body, bone, at skin. On this stone she knelt, holding a child, not dead, not alive. On this beach, between worlds of the living, worlds of the dead, she held out her warm hands. The body of the baby, grey as the pebble, grey as the life draining back from the tide line, back into the lungs of the sea, grey as the sky when weeping. She knelt, her hands warm, her body shaking, and fear enough to bring a jolt of life. Air rush, the sound of crying, the sound of life, of earth leaving water, meeting sky. The stone touches my hand, its gift grey. The sky weeps with my eyes. The fear I hold returns to the sea. 3 women stand on a shoreline. Stones, stories, history. I'm going to share my screen with you because I brought some images just as a way of enabling us to think and maybe meditate with some of the experiences that I want to share just now as part of my journey, which is a journey of faith and a journey of prayer and a journey of family and a journey of, I think I would also say disintegration as well as integration. Through my work and engagement with people seeking sanctuary in the United Kingdom and worldwide, pretty much all my knitting has been undone. And I have had to piece together again a new version of myself. And I really have come to understand this as what Jesus means when he says, you must die to yourself and be born again. And that it's thanks to the wounds that the refugees have brought to me and their testimony of the way that Christ lives in them, of whatever faith they might be, that I've come to a place where I might leave my old faith, which was perhaps too small to hold the horror of what I experience today on a daily basis, and actually help me join the voices of those who have sought and found refuge and found it deeply in their own faiths, and that I too might sing with them in their foreign land. So this image that I'm giving you to start with, I should just say, these are the hands of the mother of my daughter. These are the hands of the mother of my daughter. She's a deep Catholic woman of prayer, and this is a sign both of wound and of celebration that she's having inked onto her hands in a refugee household in Khartoum in the Sudan. This is an epic story. This is an epic story. The epic story of the refugees. I've heard it pretty much every day for the last 15 years. And at one point, I began to be as numb as Pope Francis says we are to the story. An epic story that no longer reaches me. I can no longer feel, because I've heard so many times people saying, well, I had to leave home. They were trying to take me into the army. There was a war. There was no money. They were threatening me with female genital mutilation. I had to leave, and I ran. And this person helped me, and that person helped me, and this person helped me, and that person helped me. And then there was a desert, and then there was a city, and then there was a broken house, and then there was a sea, and then there was a broken boat, and then the boat sank, and then there was a rescue, and then there was fingerprinting and a census, and they counted me, and then they made me go somewhere else to be counted, as it was under Caesar Augustus, when all had to be counted. And then they took me to another broken home, and then people came after me with sticks, and my life was in danger, and I had to flee again. And there I was in Italy, and there I was in France, and there I was hiding, because they were going to detain us all and maybe kill us all. And there I was hiding in a box under a lorry, and then I arrived and I didn't know where. Again and again and again, I've heard this story told in different languages, through translators, through my research and through my advocacy, and just through being a human being whose home is a home for refugees. It's an epic story. And as the size of my faith disintegrated, the smallness of my faith disintegrated, because it couldn't contain what I was hearing. And because my cries of, my God, why have you forsaken them, did not appear to be heard by the UK Home Office, or by the United Nations, or by the governments of many agencies, or by the traffickers, or by the warmongers, or by those trafficking in weapons. Because my cries weren't being heard, then my hope and my faith, the muscle that is hope, was really so exercised so hard that it was breaking. And I found myself in the middle of a faith story that was one where I found myself in the wilderness, where I was disoriented, where the story didn't make any more sense, where I couldn't understand what it meant to be told that gold and incense and myrrh were these great things that were given to the refugee Christ child to symbolize kingliness and future leadership. Until gradually, after I began to collect up the broken pieces, rather as we might after we've shared bread, after we've shared in the body of Christ. As I began to piece them together, the body of Christ came to me again, but in glorious form. And today I am wearing for you my gold, and on my head too, in coins. You can probably just see them on the headdress. They tend to get tucked away in my not quite right hair, but there you can just about see it if I lean forward. And I've brought this little beautiful gift that I was given. And in it, if I take off the lid, is frankincense and myrrh. And for Eritrean refugees and many refugees from the Semitic families and the Cushitic families that inhabit the Horn of Africa, gold, incense, and myrrh are not symbols of kingship, but they are the ordinary, everyday things you need to make a life, to make a home, to raise a family, and to know how to make peace within a household. When a woman wears the gold, It says she's a mother. It says she's someone who can make coffee, who can sit on the floor making coffee. And if you make coffee in that part of the world, it takes 3 hours. It's not putting on the kettle, boiling a pot. It takes 3 hours. And whilst you're doing that, whilst you're making the coffee, it's a whole ceremony. It's rather like being at Mass. And as part of it, the incense has to rise and the cups have to be cooked in the right way, in the right direction, with the right sounds, with the right people in place. And then they have to be passed around in a ceremony in order of respect and age. And then they have to be drunk. And over the course of that, the conversation will be one of how we bring peace to the household, how we bring peace to the family, how we might rejoice in the wedding of a beloved son, or how we might mourn the passing of a beloved relative. Gold, incense, and myrrh are what the wise ones give to Mary and Joseph and the Christ child in a time of utter crisis, where they already know from visiting Herod that they will have to go back another way, that it's not safe to take the normal high road, that they can't go back to the palace for fear for their lives, that they as wise ones are already on the run. And they share their fear, their knowledge of the journey, just as refugees then share it. Don't go that way, that's not safe. If you're going to go to Lampedusa, don't go with these people, that boat will sink. If you get on a boat, make sure you're not asked to carry an AK-47. They're really dangerous, you won't know what you're doing, but you might be asked. All the things you have to do to keep yourself safe will be shared in that place of meeting and gathering. And the gold and the incense and myrrh, these are the precious things that you might have in your bag, because they are the things with which, from the Horn of Africa, once you arrive somewhere, you can reconstitute your household and your everyday life. Yes, we can interpret them as the great symbols of the Epiphany. But actually, that epiphany we can also interpret, as I have come to do, thanks to the liberating work that refugees have done in my life through their everyday practice and their invitations to share at their table and be part of these ceremonies. I've come to understand that gold and incense and myrrh are just like us putting the kettle on and dropping a tea bag into a cup when a friend comes round in tears and says, I don't know what to do. These are the daily answers to our prayers. And here they are as gold and incense and myrrh. And when I use these, and when I now perform a coffee ceremony myself in my own household, and people come into the room and they see me dressed like this with my daughter's mother's scarf and the gold and the headdress, and they smell the incense rising mixed with the coffee, the first thing they will think or say to me is, you have taken us home, taken us back to a place of peace before the days of exile, and we find them again through this work, through your hands. The epic story, maybe when we listen to it, maybe when we hear it, maybe through Advent, reading the story of the birth of the Christ child through the lens of the refugee might take us beyond that idea of just going to Egypt as a refugee, but actually maybe thinking, as I have been doing, what would it mean for me to have to go back to the place I fear most in my life and my tradition? Because Egypt was the place of slavery. Egypt was the place of the Passover. Egypt was the place of the killing of the firstborn. Egypt was the place of the labour on the pyramids, of bricks and straw. What would it have meant for Joseph to hear and decide to go back there, back to that place of enslavement? And maybe for you to think at the moment of those who are refugees in Ethiopia and in the Sudan, who in that terrible conflict in Ethiopia at the moment are being herded up out of refugee camps where they've sought sanctuary and sent back to Eritrea, into the torture camps and into the military, and then forced to try and kill their brothers and people who they've seen. That's the worst thing that could happen to the refugees in the places of safety. And here is Joseph making that decision to go to Egypt, like having to make a decision to go back to where you came from. Those terrifying words that are shouted in racist abuse at many a person seeking sanctuary in our land, go back to where you came from, is like saying, go back to Egypt, the Egypt of war, the Egypt of pain. So just to frame that with a little bit of kind of biblical reflection just at the start and what I bring to this story, and then to take you through the epic story as I've experienced it. So this is me in the Sudan, having just been dressed in gold, whilst there is frankincense and whilst there is myrrh burning around a coffee ceremony. This is me being made to look the part and changed. And there's so much in the biblical texts about putting on the raiment of Christ. And this, when I look at this picture, I mean, this is not me. I feel deeply uncomfortable dressing like this. And if you see my hands and my feet, they are covered in henna tattoos. But this understanding of me, this was safety in the Sudan. This kept me safe within the refugee camp. This helped me cross the borders. At the airport, when they saw my hands, they did not say, where's your passport and your visa, even though I had them ready. They said, what beautiful hands, please come on through. There's something here about the clothing that actually reminds me of the ways in which we think of those ways of being clothed clothed by others in their righteousness. Of course, our hospitality looks very different officially within Europe. This is the conditional hospitality that Europe offered in 2013 to the 370 Eritrean refugees who drowned in a sinking off the coast of Lampedusa. One of the people who drowned is the subject of a beautiful artwork that is being produced at the moment. She drowned whilst in the process of giving birth. She gave birth to her child underwater. Her child never took a first breath. When they were washed up on the beach, they were joined in an umbilical cord. Inside each one of these coffins is a refugee, not an asylum seeker, because posthumously, the Italian government decided it would grant everyone asylum who is in one of these coffins. Normally, that wouldn't be the case. Normally, there would be a rejection or a long period and process before a status was determined. And this was the condition of our hospitality, the condition of death. This is one of my all-time favourite images from the last 5 years, and this is an image I took in the Calais refugee camps. And this is a church that was constructed by Eritrean refugees in the Calais camps. There was also a mosque opposite it, but as you can probably see from the mud and the puddles, the site had already been bulldozed by the French authorities, who no longer wished there to be places of worship and places of makeshift hospitality. They no longer wished there to be little tiny shops and stalls within the camps that people had made to resemble home, where people would orderly place out the tomatoes or little packs of Gauloise cigarettes in a tiny moment of pride in their shopkeeping, or where they had a small restaurant. But instead, these places were being bulldozed when I was there. But inside that tarpaulin church, there were icons painted on plastic, icons out of the Eritrean Orthodox tradition. And there was a line drawn down the centre of the church, and on the one side, the women would be sitting very quietly on the floor, having taken their shoes off and walked and sat, with their scarves over their heads very loosely as a mark of the respect that is their faith. And on the other side, the men, sitting and praying with them in hope, because it was all there was left. And I've come to realise the value of my own faith and my practices of prayer when I'm at the end of my resources. And as a middle-class professional, I tend to have a overblown sense of pride and arrogance in what my resources might be. Nothing has sent me to prayer more than the intractability of the attempts that we might make to offer hospitality under these circumstances. And yet here, with the time they had and what they had, they built a cathedral, and they built it out of what was lying around. And it's beautiful. In contrast, and you can see a little of the contrast between the housing there, the French government decided it would make people safe by putting a big fence around, fingerprinting and iris scanning the refugees the asylum seekers as they went in and out, and forcing people to live in these boxes, which would take 14 people at a time. So young boys, men mainly, all put into here. Aside from the safeguarding concerns that this raised for us as a delegation from the UK government, there is a deeper issue of concern around this. In fact, two. One, which my colleague Teresa Piacentini has written beautifully about, where she says, isn't it incredible that the symbol par excellence of global trade, the container, would be used to imprison and force people to stay? So our goods might move relatively freely, but our people must stay in an enclosure. But the other thing is that when we finished with these transportation vessels, we send these containers to the global south. We send them to places like Eritrea and Ethiopia, and they're used for a whole range of purposes, sometimes for shops, often for housing. For Eritrean refugees who were asked to go into these places, this is Egypt. These are the places that they were held as torture camps in Sawa and in Eritrea. These are places where unspeakable torture was meted out against people. To walk into one of these might mean, as it has done for one of the members of my family, that you are not allowed out for 7 years. And when you are allowed out, you cannot see because you have been deprived of light for so long. This is what it means in Europe to try and offer safety and hospitality. Two of the philosophers who've done a lot of thinking about how we came to be in this mess have said this. The masses were not deceived. They desired fascism, and that is what has to be explained. Desire cannot be deceived. It can deceive you. It happens that sometimes one desires against one's own interests. And again, when I look at slides like this, the desire that represents, and I think about this quotation, I am minded of the many ways in which, through our exclusions and our border controls, our belief that anyone who comes is one person too many, we are desiring against our own interests, because we're actually mitigating against the presence of beauty and diversity and peace and faith within our midst. After I'd been in the Calais camps, I wrote another poem about daffodils. This isn't an exactly happy poem either, and I am just going to look it up. I do know it by heart, but I may forget it because it's a little while since I've actually recited it. But this is my antidote to Wordsworth, for those of you who know the famous poem, Daffodils. And I wrote it because in the Calais camps, at the base of one of the concrete posts, there was a tiny little cluster of daffodils. Daffodils. For the first time, the daffodils do not bring me cheerfulness. Their nodding yellow heads, incongruent, stubborn, sunshine at the wrong end of winter. It is wartime. The earth wrestles against the seed corn. The ploughed fields may or may not see harvest. There are old gun emplacements on the cliff tops, looking across the estuary to the nuclear power plant. Around their concrete bases, the same jaundiced flowers, spring's heralds or signs of our fear. I do not know whether to fight or to flee. I do not know if the east wind will spread pollen or freeze away the first hope of life. On the borders of Europe, on the borders of America, on the borders of Australia, on the borders of the United Kingdom, they are herding people into cages and sending them back to the bombs. And on the borders of the field, there are daffodils, nodding away as the bodies wash again out to sea. At root, I think that is, for me, a point of lamentation and a point of desolation. Perhaps the lowest point I met in my faith was actually leaving young people in the Calais camps, knowing there was nothing I had to promise. And the 4 MPs from Scotland who joined us on that delegation have spoken eloquently in Parliament about that being the hardest thing. Knowing that these are people who just want to join family in the United Kingdom, people who Lord Dubs has been advocating for years, and we will not do it. And we will not allow the right of children to join their closest family who happen to be in the United Kingdom, because the fingerprint we have taken from them tells us that they are in France, and therefore they must make their life in France or in Italy or in Germany or somewhere else. 2000 years ago, in his peace treaty of the Roman Empire, Tacitus said, "They create devastation and call it peace." And this is the Calais camps after the bulldozers have taken away the church. There are other places in my work where this is also true, but lived differently. And these are the majority of my work at the moment, as well as being in Scotland, is in the global south, and particularly in Palestine. So this is the land of our Lord's birth, and this is Palestine. And this is how the blind are helped to see. This is where I see the gospel come alive. This is in the Islamic University of Gaza, in the basement, in a building that's been bombed many times. And here we see the Braille type writer for the whole of the Gaza Strip, as out of the tenets of Islam and respecting those. The Islamic University of Gaza puts in a translation service for the documents and the course materials it has that are typed out by hand for all of those who are partially sighted. And I'm thinking about how much we're complaining in higher education at the moment about having to read transcripts or record our lectures in order to make them available to people with visual or audible impairments. And here we have the one typewriter doing it for the whole of the Gaza Strip. Such faith, such love. In back in 2014, so before the hospitality crisis began, I was working with the Gaza Strip, and my colleagues were really concerned because of the bombardments. And so here in the Holy Land is a video of the images of a thankfully empty Islamic University of Gaza being bombed. And that's the call for prayer you can just hear over the top of it. I had a phone call from my colleague, a Skype call from my colleague in the Gaza Strip to reassure me that they were well and to let me know what they were doing to survive the bombardments that they were experiencing. And he said, look, what we were going to do with you in our project, which was bring you over, have you here, do some work together, construct a program for English language teaching for those who are working in humanitarian aid organizations, and for Arabic teaching for those working in humanitarian aid organizations as a peacemaking project. We can't do it. You can't come, we can't leave, we can't meet. And at that point, we didn't even have Zoom and we didn't have good bandwidth. We just had the little wheel of death that goes round when you can't actually connect. And so I said to him, look, go away, rethink, see what it is you want to do. And he came back, he said, look, we're getting lots of reports. So a couple of months later, we're getting lots of reports of people who can't hear. You know, we have a real difficulty because a lot of people have had burst eardrums or real impairments from the bombing raids because it's such a densely populated area. So he said, this is what I'd like to do. I'd like to bring people who are hearing impaired into the university to give them a chance to get a diploma in deaf sign language in Arabic and also in the use of technology. So in contrast to what you've just seen, this is their first day at the university.
أهلا وسهلا بكم. لأول مرة في الجامعة الإسلامية تم فتح تخصص خاص في الصم، فقد جئنا لنتعرف إلى كل الأقسام في الجامعة، وقد عرفنا كل الأماكن في الجامعة. لأول مرة في فلسطين اهتمت الجامعة بتخصصات للصم، فأصبحنا متساويين مع الناس العادية. نتمنى أن تتطور ويزداد الاهتمام في الصم إن شاء الله. طبعا شكرا كتير لكم ونحن سعداء جدا. عندما سمعت بأنه في فلسطين في الجامعة الإسلامية فتحوا تخصص للصم في الجامعة، فأنا كتير سعدت جدا وكنت متشجعة أن أسجل، وأنا خبرت كل صديقاتي وصحباتي إنهم يجوا يسجلوا معنا في الجامعة، وكلهم طبعا سجلوا كتير سعداء في هذا التخصص، وهم كتير سعداء. وأصبحت جئنا إلى الجامعة لحتى يثبت وجود الأماكن والتخصصات اللازمة للصم.
And I'm sharing that also, and very much dedicating it to my colleagues and friends in the Gaza Strip who they want the negative images to be replaced with that joy. And that joy in what those young women are saying, which is the gist of it, you can tell just from the gestures and the sign language, but we are so proud to be able to go to university. We are so proud to be able to study. We are deaf, but we can hear because of the work that we're doing at the university, and that is just a real source of hope for them, and that they then can be teachers themselves and they can teach back rather than always being recipients. So that little story of joy, and again, I'm just minded of Luke's gospel, a sight to the blind, the deaf can hear, those beautiful verses that to me come alive in this hard work that people do to rebuild their lives. So let me bring it back to Scotland, and one of my roles is to chair the New Scots refugee integration work for the Scottish Government, Scottish Refugee Council, and COSLA, the Local Authorities Network. And in Scotland, we've made some new rules. We have a wonderful policy, which is that all asylum seekers will be integrated from day one. They do not have to wait until they have status, which can take some people 21 years. Such is the chaos within the refugee determination process in the UK Home Office. On average, it takes 7. And in that time, you've not been allowed to work, and you've had to live on £37 a week if you're lucky, and otherwise you've been destitute and dependent on charity. So what we say is we integrate from day one. That doesn't stop the problem of destitution, but it does say that you can access certain services and certain forms of care. It's a way of going a step towards improving the hospitality we offer. The other thing that we've done is allow refugees the right to vote in Scotland. Deborah Kayembe, a human rights lawyer and dear friend of mine, who was the first Black African woman to have a portrait placed in the Royal Society of Edinburgh, said this in January 2014 when she realised that refugees from certain countries would be granted the right to vote in the independence referendum. She said, "So much blood lies underneath the right to make a cross." And again, that word comes to me not as the right to make a cross on a ballot paper, but also as the right to make a cross. Destitution, detention, and deportation are the 3 Ds that we work with in the policy world. We work against destitution because it is a policy of our government to create destitution in this particular segment of the population through often refusing people's asylum claims. So round about 60% of people are refused at the first pass, and then about 70% of that 60% are then granted refugee status after a long, costly and difficult appeal process. We spend a lot of money on detention. It's actually cheaper to keep someone full board in Gleneagles Hotel than in Dungavel. I've visited Dungavel many times. I would rather go to Gleneagles Hotel. And then deportation, which of course is a very costly thing. And you may have seen just yesterday the heartfelt pleas of a young boy begging the government not to deport his father because of the Windrush situation, and his father was being deported back to Jamaica. We talk about the refugee crisis. I talk about the hospitality crisis. Because the crisis is a crisis of hospitality. The majority of refugee receiving countries are in the global south. The largest numbers by a long way and in the millions are in the Sudan, are in Uganda, are in Turkey, are in Jordan, and are in Ethiopia and Kenya. That by a long way. I mean, millions more, and Pakistan, millions more. The one country in Europe that took the number of refugees that we say as part of our signing of the Council of Europe Convention that we will take as a pro rata of GDP should there be a war on our borders, as there was with Syria, that the only country that did that was Germany. And interestingly, as a result of doing that, Germany's GDP is the only one that's really been rising over the last few years. And that's attributable to the new efforts in the integration regime with refugees, people determined to make a new life and what that then produces for them. So as well as all the amazing benefits that I think there are that come when we practice hospitality full stop, when we exercise that as a tenet of our faith, it also happens that that other part of God's word is true, that if we do these things, all will be added to us. Hospitality crisis. This was the welcome sign in the flat, in a refugee flat in Khartoum when I went to visit my own family. Welcome. They wrote it in English and they spelt it wrong. Only, oh my goodness, they spelt it right. So Scotland's response to the refugee crisis has been to offer hospitality at a ratio of 1 to 5 of the resettlement programme. We've probably got about 3,000 to 4,000 refugees come from Syria now, and they are being integrated across all 32 local authorities. I will admit to making an error of judgment around this in the policy discussions, because I was really keen that we would keep those refugees in Glasgow, where we'd already practiced the dispersal scheme and practiced offering hospitality to asylum seekers, where there were services and other things. I was really worried about stretching the services in the other 31 local authorities, and that when we do that, we tend to see a rise in racism. We haven't done. If anything, we've seen attitudes improve through the resettlement scheme across all of the local authorities when the Scottish Refugee Council did a polling. And we've seen just beautiful, beautiful responses around the country to this. Absolutely the best of the country has been seen in these programs, and particularly that church groups had a chance to step in, and English language clubs, knitting clubs, food drop-ins, all kinds of wonderful things going on. But not least just the ability for people to come to a church and worship with you without anyone asking who you are and what the torture was that you experienced and whether or not you might be someone who's suitable to be offered hospitality, but just to be a person of faith worshipping. Again and again through the Gospels, we're told you have to change your life. It's also the line of one of my favourite poems by Rilke, you have to change your life. And I find that refugees and my work with refugees has made me change my life. I realised if I was going to take seriously what I had seen and heard and the injunction on us to offer hospitality, I was going to need to open up my home. And so for the last 15 years, our home has been a house of hospitality, and we've taken in destitute asylum seekers long before it was a trendy thing to do. Mainly we've had mainly women who were pregnant and who've been trafficked. And who had no money and no rights and no recourse to public funds. And they've come and they've lived and they've shared, and we've eaten some really weird food and we've laughed a lot. And we're in touch with all of them still, and they all call us auntie and uncle and granny and grandpa. Because like Christ says on the cross, behold your mother, behold your son. This is also what we have experienced and I've experienced in my faith, that in the life of every refugee, I hear Christ crucified saying, behold your mother, and behold your son. I found that the rule of law in this country is a border that runs through my heart and my home. This was a vigil we had when the UK Border Agency was threatening to deport our foster daughter, age 16, and just held vigil and held space because we had nothing else we could do but pray. I've written open letters to the UK Border Agency, like the one the little boy wrote to the Home Secretary, begging that she wouldn't deport her father yesterday. Over the years, I've seen miracles happen again and again. This is like the visitation. When I saw this picture, it was as if the child that is not in my barren womb leapt in my womb, because this is my daughter's mother, holding to her the children from whom she'd been separated after she was taken and trafficked and eventually claimed asylum in Sweden, holding to her these children after they were able to join her under family reunion, all 6 of her children, not our foster daughter who has stayed with us, but the other 6 who were left behind. What am I learning through this collapse of faith and this growth of faith and this work with refugees? The new world, the new city, the new Jerusalem, the new kingdom, the kingdom of God, it's not given whole any more than the new self is given abruptly in psychotherapy. It's given a little at a time, one hug at a time, one bunch of flowers at a time, one poem at a time, one healing at a time, one pronouncement at a time, one coffee at a time, one promise at a time, one commandment at a time. We've been here before in history. It is an epic story. We were here in the gospel days. We were here when Joseph, Mary, and Jesus fled from Herod's knives and the massacre of the children. We were here through the Holocaust, and we said never again. And we're here again. It's not a question of whether it will come to our shores. It is that it is here, and we are living through it right now. In my work, and this is with one of the young dancers that we work with in Ghana, who's given permission and delight for me to share her acting face with you. We say that it is our job, it is our duty and our joy to hold the bowl of tears and expand the space for joy. The dominant script, the script that is not the gospel script, but the script that socializes all, says Walter Brueggemann, is the script of therapeutic, technocratic, consumer militarism. And that script has failed. It cannot make us safe, and it cannot make us happy. It sends us to Sparta in that Greek understanding. And in Sparta, there was no conjugal love, no mother love, no filial devotion, no friendship. Citizens alone, and all virtue was civic virtue. That is all. So as I come to the end of what I want to share with you, I want to share these beautiful words and then a song from the Scottish singer-songwriter who's worked with my team at the University of Glasgow and to produce some music. But in her extraordinary piece of drama, Wind Resistance, she speaks about the geese and the birds that fly over the border, the birds that don't need passports, the birds that actually we care about so much that we'll ring them to make sure that they get to safety. We'll track them to help them. We'll take them food and water when they land if we think they might be in distress. And she says this about the geese that fly over her land in September. She says this: in September, the geese snake across the Firth of Forth from their summer nests in Greenland and the coastal cliffs of Iceland, clattering and honking in an ever-shifting skein. My garden is a flight path. I watch, I listen. The outstretched wingtips of each migrating goose create an upwash, a pocket of wind resistance for the geese tucked in behind and below. These nooks of ease, these aerodynamic sanctuaries, they cut the drag by up to 65%. It's a wonder, and it's a gale-bitten struggle to sustain cooperation. And every goose takes a turn, stepping up, falling back, labouring and resting. Stepping up, falling back, labouring and resting. Like skyborn socialists, no lone bird bears the brunt. It's a gorgeous symbiotic dance, stepping up, falling back, labouring and resting. Stepping up, falling back, labouring and resting. When I met my daughter's mother for the first time, and I was given this scarf, after she'd met her daughter again, and they'd embraced and embraced and embraced and embraced, a little like the disciples need to do with Jesus after the resurrection. Eventually she turned to me, and she didn't hold on to me to start with. And then she looked at me, and I was crying and she was crying, and she kissed me 100 times. And then she looked at me and she put her hands to my face to take the tears. And she rubbed them together on her hands, and she put them on her face to take the tears. And then she rubbed them together on her hands. And then she said, coffee.
Beba sheba hiabolo, beba sheba hiabolo, kajimbongo ni biboni, asobano hamilo, kajimbongo ni biboni, asobano hamilo. Beba sheba hiabolo, beba sheba hiabolo.
How far around the corner can you see? And do you know what a new day brings? Is the earth beneath your feet as sure as it can be? And will the road rise to meet you?
Beba sheba hiabolo, beba sheba hiabolo, kajimbongo ni biboni, jemo trimi koni owami, kajimbongo ni biboni, jemo trimi koni owami, Beba sheba yabolo. Beba sheba yabolo.
What's sailing over the horizon? And do the waters ebb or flow? And if you swim, then will you reach dry land? And will the road rise to meet you?
Beba sheba yabolo. Beba sheba yabolo. Kai mwake wenye show.
Time will come, a time will come.
Moko moko le wasane.
You'll need a hand to hold.
Kai mwake dele mi jeke.
When it comes and when it comes,
Moko moko le
will the
wasane.
road rise?
Bewa. Beba sheba yabolo. Beba sheba yabolo. Beba sheba yabolo. Beba sheba yabolo. Beba she.
Time will come.
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 Beba sheba yabolo. Beba sheba yabolo. Beba sheba yabolo. Beba sheba yabolo.
Thank you.
Alison, thank you. I will come to thank you again after the chat, but just now, just to so many thoughts and reflections in my head and feelings, and the major one is I think I've had the epiphany of epiphanies around gold, frankincense, and myrrh. The story is completely changed. It will give me hours of thought. Thank you for that. At the moment, I think we move to questions and chat. And Callum, I'll hand over to you for navigation of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosa. And just before we do, a reminder to everyone, please do continue to use the chat. I can see the first question in the chat. Please do use the chat function. If you're on a phone or tablet, you might need to press more at the bottom of your screen and then chat. Otherwise, you should see it at the bottom of your screen, and share your questions there, and I'll put them to Alison. But Alison, thank you very, very much. It took me right back to an undergrad lecture in the seminar room there. And one of the things that struck me, just maybe to get the ball rolling, one of the things that struck me and the reason it took me straight back there was, I remember you speaking to us when I was studying and you were teaching us, the importance of changing mindset and changing the way that we look at things. Do you think that changing people's perception, you know, things like you mentioned renaming it a hospitality crisis, do you think that's key to addressing the challenges? And how do you think we can do that? How can we change mindsets and change perception?
Do you know, Callum, I mean, it takes a village. So I think it's I think it takes all the energy and strength that we have. And I think, you know, I often think of Paul and you know, the gifts of the Holy Spirit. It's like we need all of them to care. And there's a lovely poem by Walt Whitman where he has a line where he basically says, you know, after all the seas are crossed as they are already crossed, and after the engineers and the geologists and the anthropologists, and after all the ists have come and done their work, he says, finally comes a poet worthy of his name, singing praise to God. And I often think about that, because I think what I think Whitman is saying there isn't all of this stuff is irrelevant because the engineers and the geologists and the anthropologists and the medics can't fix it. I think what he's saying is, after the human community, in its own human power, has done the best it can, then we change the story, because that's what the poet does. Then we change the story. Then we change the language of the story. And the beautiful Welsh poet R.S. Thomas says, poetry is that which enters the intellect by way of the heart. And I think that for me, that's, it's like, it's knowing also where your gifts lie. It's like mine are in language. I'm a performer. I'm a presenter. I write prayers and poems. That's what I do. I love to teach. I can be really practical, and I can fill out 1,000 forms for you if you ask me to. But actually, where is it I coalesce around what the best of me can be? And it's around the word made flesh. It's around the incarnational. So that's my bit. But, do not ask my husband, who is upstairs at the moment as operations director for SCIAF, working out what to do about the shortfall in funding, and how on earth the women who have survived rape in DR Congo are actually going to get the pennies that go into the wee box, and what the pre-post opening protocol, the post opening protocol, and the post opening protocol are going to be when you do the money collections. Yeah, I can't do what he does. He can't do what I do, but between us, we can do something that might mean that the children are fed. And in order for the children to be fed, we need all of it. And for me, finally comes the poet, singing praise to God. For me, there's also something absolutely critical that we learned through the dark days of we're waiting and having knocks on the door from the border agency on a regular basis and expecting the deportation of our daughter. Every single day we practice gratitude. Every single day at table, she taught us to prayer, a new version of the Lord's Prayer. And that really, and so every day as we would come to grace at mealtime, she would say, and I pray for the Home Office because they really need it. And theirs is not an easy job. And I think that meant that she was calm when she had to sign on a weekly basis, but also love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. And she brought that to me. I mean, all I could do for a while was be foul-mouthed about the people who were being so cruel to our daughter, as you would be. But that wasn't what did it. What did it was love, gratitude, prayer, thanks. I mean, the basis of what is in our liturgies. Overall. So yeah, that's what I would say. I think it takes all sorts, but I do think, I mean, at the moment, every consultation I go into, Callum, people say we need to change our media, we need to change the narrative. And I say to them, so you have to change your narrative and how you speak about it, because we have to be the change we want to see. So don't talk about a refugee crisis. If the word asylum seeker is starting to be used in a demeaning way, it didn't used to be, but now it is. So when my grandfather took in asylum seekers from the Prague Spring, this was a badge of honor, but now it isn't. So let's change our language. And so we tend in our advocacy organizations we tend to speak of people who are seeking sanctuary. So we don't make it a label on a person, we make it a gesture or an action that they are doing. So it's the action that we focus on, not the person, in order to try and diminish the racism. But these are, that's what I can do as a linguist and a poet. But others like my husband, he can do he's doing great work at the moment for SCIAF. I don't understand any of it, and it all involves spreadsheets.
Thank you, Alison. I mean, incredible witness. Thank you. If I can take Kevin's question, obviously something he says very special has happened in your own faith life to make you do what you do. Was this a gradual change or a singular moment of transformation for you?
No, it was gradual. I mean, in some ways, I've been lucky. I was raised in a Christian household. My grandparents offered hospitality to the people who came over as workers after the Second World War into the cotton mills of Lancashire. And there were stories of hospitality of those people and of the Prague Spring in our family. When my grandfather died, the Pakistani and Bangladeshi communities in Blackburn, Lancashire, lined the road as his coffin went up because he was the person who gave them their first meal when they arrived, and they've never forgotten. And that story was in their families. So there's something really, there's something so basic about the gesture of hospitality that is genuinely, the Oxford English Dictionary says, it's entertainment of strangers, conviviality and goodwill. So it's not even a hard, difficult thing to do. I mean, conviviality and goodwill, that sounds like a lot of fun. It doesn't have to be really hard work. And I think, and it's not meant to be, I don't think, in my experience of it. Often what is harder is the receiving of hospitality than the giving of it. And I do a workshop, which is often a bit of a light bulb moment for people. I've done it a lot in the churches, saying, think of a time when you were a guest in someone's house that you didn't know that well. What were you nervous about? And this huge list comes out. Think of a time when you were asked to offer a meal to somebody who was a bit of a stranger and you didn't know them. What were you afraid of? And this huge list comes out, and you can do the exercise for yourselves. And then I say, compare the two, and you realize that we're all on the same page. It's not two different sets of fears, it's the same set of fears. We're united in our care and concern for one another. But I think, it was tiny steps. It was a little thing every year. And I think the practice of the Iona community of an annual accounting process for our keeping of a gospel of justice and peace and reconciliation, for an accounting for the use of our resources, time, environmental resources, and money, for our devotion and reading and prayer, and for our commitment to meet with one another and care for the community. That annual practice would take me on a little every year. And I would think, maybe that was okay, but actually there's a bit more I could do. And because we did it to one another, it wasn't a private thing that you did for yourself, but you shone light on it. And so we would literally sit around in a group of 6 of us in the base community, that's a family group, going, so I spent £9.60 on this particular item of clothing, and so we got right down to brass tacks. And because what you spend your money on is what you care about. It's your values budget, and that learning about that at an early age was really helpful to me. Realizing that, and then thinking, if this faith is something I am going to live in, if this is the best story I have to live by, and I have found, and I'm enhanced by many other practices from many other faiths. I don't find them in any way threatening to me, and I willingly partake and participate in what I am invited to do within other faith communities. But actually, this is the one that holds me. This is the one I fight. This is the one I love. This is the one I wrestle with. And, I'm 53 years of age. I'm too old to change now.
There are questions coming in thick and fast, Alison. So,
I'm just going to try and pull the screen up so I can keep an eye on them as well.
The next one that I'd like to take is Anne's question. And we could spend a whole night on this alone, but I wonder if you could give us almost a headline answer to this. What can we do?
Yeah. So I have a principle, which is one that I took from George MacLeod, who's the founder of the Iona community. If you are going to give of time or money, give 50% to immediate humanitarian need, and give 50% to tackling the causes of the injustices that have produced that need. So for me, if people say, what can I do for refugees? My answers to those questions are, where is the immediate humanitarian crisis in the world right now? Right now, if I have to single out a place that's close to my heart, it's Ethiopia, Eritrea, Sudan, Horn of Africa. And right now, I wouldn't be saying to you, give to the small grassroots organisations on the ground, which is what I would say if you're doing it for Greece. I would say, give to the International Red Cross. I know from my husband upstairs, because he's trying to work out whether or not the Catholic Church can get aid into that part of the world, that they can't, that it's really difficult at the moment. It will become easier later, but that the first responders are the ones you need to give to. The first responders are the ones who will be on the ground, and they are people like Médecins Sans Frontières, and they are people like the International Red Cross. And right now, with the best intelligence I can get, and my intelligence is very good, they're saying the International Red Cross. And time and again, that has been my answer. In the Calais camps, I said, give to Médecins Sans Frontières, to Doctors Without Borders. Their radical medical justice is a work of wonder and grace. If it's around the Mediterranean, I would again say Médecins Sans Frontières, and some of the projects that are coming out of St. George's, Malta, and the attempts there to fund rescue missions in the Mediterranean. Those are the humanitarian crises. Right back at home, Refugee, Maryhill Integration Network, the Night Shelter, the Destitution Network, any of those groups that are doing work with on the ground with refugees. And I think there are a number of these organisations that are working directly out of faith groups. There's a Sikh group working, there's a mosque group working, there's one coming out of the Archdiocese. Any of those that are doing, people have no food. People have no clothes for their children. People have no phone credit to phone their mums and dads and say they're alive. People might not have the telephone numbers and therefore need to be able to search for their family members. So giving to those organisations because they know what the need is. That's the immediate need on the ground. So that's the humanitarian. And root causes. So there's an organisation called Right to Remain that I was on the board of for a long time. It provides information and a toolkit to anyone fighting for migration justice, regardless of whether they are EU citizens who are getting knockbacks because they filled out a bit of the form wrong, all the way through to asylum seekers. And it's mainly asylum seekers and refugees they work with, and others on no recourse to public funds. Their toolkit has saved millions of lives. And in essence, at its start, their toolkit was a distillation of all of the best intelligence we gathered and the evaluation we did of the things that had worked when we were campaigning for our daughter. And because of what we did so much with a great host of faithful people joining us who just got on with it. And many of you will have done that. If you remember my daughter Rima, thank you for what you did. But what we did with what you did was think about it. Think about what it represented, and then build in both a process of how we thought about all campaigns that were successful or all campaigns that failed and what we failed to do and why. And then we put them into a toolkit. So all of that is there. It's there in Tigrinya, in Farsi, in Arabic, in French, in Spanish, in Urdu, we've translated it. And it goes onto people's phones in detention centres. It's used by the legal profession. There's a copy of it in every MP's surgery right across Scotland. Just funding that toolkit, donating to them, is really getting at the root causes, and it changes the laws to be able to help people more. So that's one of the key organisations that I point to. The other thing that I often speak of in this context is give to organisations that are trying to stop the trade in armaments. Because if we stop the wars, we stop the need of people to leave home. And my daughter never wanted to leave home. She used to climb this tree. I don't know that the tree still exists, but she never wanted to leave that tree and her grandfather's backyard and carrying the milk can. You know, those memories she has. She still can't go back home. She's still not a UK citizen. Maybe one day we'll be able to do that. But right now it's a war zone again in her life. She was born a refugee in a refugee camp in the Sudan. You know, she's known war all her life, as have many others, and others who I know are coming to speak to you later in the session. So, I give regularly to campaign against the arms trade because it feels like the most congruent thing that can go to the root causes. And I think for me, it's organisations like Pax Christi that I have followed all my life. I have a little book by my bedside that I read every day, and I have done since I was 15, when I bought the book in the bookshop on Iona when I first visited. And those readings, they've just carried me through. And I think that kind of work is really valuable and important. And maybe finally, Callum, already by turning up tonight, you've done so much. I can't tell you what it means for me in the work that I do to know that you've listened to me and that you have done me the gracious honour of listening to the story that I have told. And that you've done that rather than reading the press and the stories in the press time and again. And you've allowed your ears to be opened to a different way of understanding that story, and that you're doing it within the spirit of faith and commitment that is, for me, it is ultimately what changes anything, that this is a depth, a spiritual work. And and it is only by the grace of God. And I think that for me, what you've already done tonight is you've just lent me your ears, and and your hearts to think with me, and your minds to think with me, and you felt alongside me, and you've thought about the story, and you're already in the chat just relating it to so many things in your own lives, and to people in our own country who are destitute, who should never be destitute. And that you are, you've offered that. And so I would also say, as I say to all groups of faith, do not underestimate the power of prayer. We had 2 or 3 people we knew prayed for us every single day through the worst of our work, and the hardest days. And I can't tell you what that meant, and what it meant when I wasn't up to it in those wilderness years of my faith, but that I knew that people were praying without prescription for me, but were praying for me. That just made all the difference.
Thank you, Alison. And I know that I echo the sentiments of, I'm sure, everyone here, but certainly the sentiments already expressed in the chat when I say thank you very much for your work and your witness tonight and throughout your work. Just picking up one thing on the point of how people can get involved, I noticed that Agatha Kai has put a message in the chat talking about the work going on in the Archdiocese of St Andrews in Edinburgh. So there are contact details there if anyone wants to get involved in the Archdiocesan working group on that.
It's fabulous. It's fabulous. It's doing amazing work.
Quickly running out of time, but if I can put another question to you from David, who says that you mentioned that your religion was too small or narrow to hold what asylum seekers and refugees have shown you. A really powerful image. Could you perhaps say a touch more about that?
Yeah, I think later in my life I've been helped quite a lot by Richard Rohr's understanding that we fall upwards, that we come to a point where the stories we were told in the nativity stories we were told about Mary, Joseph and the donkey, there wasn't a donkey, and these versions of the Christian story and the story of the nativity, which are actually different versions, and that in Matthew's gospel it wasn't even a stable, and it wasn't in Bethlehem, or Bethlehem was the home and it wasn't from Nazareth. I mean, these irascible broken up bits. And I think I'd got the story that was the Christmas story, and it was strong and it held me, and I got the carols and I got the practices, just as that example. Similarly with the Easter story as well, I'd understood it from within my life of what it had been. I was not prepared for what it would be like to try and then understand my faith when I became a foster mother to a refugee daughter. What it meant to foster, what it meant to kind of encounter it felt like on the road to Emmaus, the companions of Jesus say, and the scripture was opened to us. And I think that's what I mean by it. I look back now and I see that what I had before was a very partial understanding, and what I have now is a much greater, richer experience of the Gospels and of the biblical texts, but also of the liturgies, of prayers. They resonate for me in a very different way. So I've been given gold, frankincense, and myrrh twice. I have it as the story, and I've got it in my, when you cut out the little bits of gold and you wrap them around an old washing up bottle and you process in with a tea towel on your head and all of that stuff, that's the nativity show. And I love that. I love that stuff. Don't get me wrong. And I think it's really valuable, but I also understand it in a different way. And the way that I understand it as an adult is, and again, it's like the ways in which, we have to come like children, and then we have to move on from the milk, and we have to, eat spiritual food that nourishes. And in a way, I think the spiritual food that had nourished me up to the point where I was doing this work, it ceased to nourish me. And so maybe that's a different image, rather than it being too small. It's just, it wasn't able to nourish me. And I remember my curate at church when I was a teenager. I was a very peculiar teenager. I think most teenagers say that about themselves, but I remember him saying to me at one point where I was struggling with something, and saying, I just don't know about this stuff. I don't know about the resurrection. It feels really weird to believe this. And what do you mean it's a virgin birth? You know, I'm just being given my biology lessons. This is not possible. And he was generous and gave me a space to ask those kinds of questions. He didn't say, therefore, you're not a quote Christian, get out, which other churches were doing at the time. He let me play intellectually. He understood that this was someone who may well go on to be a professor. So we better give her brain a bit of latitude. And he said to me, Alison, if your God can't cope with your suffering, forget that God and wait for the God who can. And I think some of the experience I've had of wilderness years, of needing to move to be a bit distanced from a church that couldn't hold me, and joining refugee churches that could hold me, or indigenous populations that could hold me, and discovering I couldn't sing the hymns anymore because I just didn't feel like that. But boy, could I sing that African music that is praise in a different language. I think that's what I mean by the kind of expansion of space, you know, the music of the world churches, of liberation. Oh my goodness, my heart, my heart.
Alison, I'm very conscious of time, and I'm sure this will, I'll get a raised eyebrow for this, but I'd like to slip one last question, and if you don't mind. Thanks for the nod, Rab. I'd like to take Gerard's question, and my apologies to anyone whose question we've not had time for, but I'd like to take one last question from Gerard, who chairs Quest and who we heard from in one of our earlier sessions. And Gerard says, we're a small charity who support LGBTI people of faith and have refugees and asylum seekers joining and looking for fellowship. We want to better understand how to support our siblings. Have you any pointers?
Yeah, oh, that's such a good question, Gerard, and such a hard group of people who have gone through so much. And so there's a little bit of information around this in the Right to Remain toolkit. But my colleague at the University of Glasgow, Francesca Stella, I'll pop it in the chat. She authored a report. Gosh, it must have been back in something like 2010, I think. She's in sociology and social policy as an area of work. She authored a report together with BMIS, which used to stand for the Black and Ethnic Minority Infrastructure Scotland. Now it just means BMIS. But they authored a report together on asylum seekers from LGBTQI backgrounds. And so I would really recommend some of their work. I would also recommend engagement if they are people coming to you who are struggling with faith and who have not found it easy to find a home within a faith community. Some of the work that Podrigo Tuma has done, I'm sure he's known to all of you, is really pertinent in this context. Some of the podcasts he's done, just the gentleness of his voice and his own testimony, I think I have found with people who have sought asylum from LGBTQI background has just been a comfort to them. So there's a research report, quite a thick research report about seeking sanctuary from and seeking asylum as LGBTQI background. And if they're people with legal challenges, I think that's the other thing I would say is give to legal justice and legal aid funds if necessary. But you know, getting a good lawyer who can defend these kinds of cases is often the most important thing. So again, the work that my husband and I do, we have a very small charity where we will help people pay legal fees if they can't do that. Because we've just identified that as an area where there's very little, people don't like giving money to lawyers because they think they're all rich. Immigration lawyers are poor as church mice. You know, they are the heroes of the peace, along with some of the human rights lawyers. And so we have a small fund where we take money, and when people, for example, a lot of people who end up getting deported under things like Windrush, when they reach 18, they have to apply for citizenship. It costs nearly £2,000. They don't have that money, therefore they cannot apply for citizenship. And then they end up in a place where their leave to remain has lapsed within a couple of years. And then they're into deportation. They could have been born here to parents who just didn't have British passports. So I think there are various things around legal justice that can be done. And again, with LGBTQI, absolutely legal protection is really important for people. And it's very reassuring. And more I go back to the legal frameworks and the rule of law. It is often also God's law. Not always, and sometimes we depart from that, and that's hard. but often it has come and been agitated for by God's people, for and on behalf of God's people. And you see it in these bizarre clauses, which are just utterly beautiful because they are justice.
Alison, thank you very much. I know that I say that personally, but I'm sure that I say that on behalf of everyone who's listened to you tonight. If I can be a bit of a pest to Rab, there's been a couple of questions for names to be repeated and stuff. Rab, is that something that we could send out by email afterwards? I've got a nod from Rab there. So for those of you who've asked for names to be repeated, if you've registered, for everyone who's registered tonight, we'll make sure those names are circulated again and links and so on. But thank you very much, Alison. Rosa.
Thanks, Callum. Thank you, Alison. Wow. I think you've seen in the chat, Alison, the response, the heartfelt responses, the moving of hearts and spirits in the conversation. And I just take one line that this indeed tonight was a moment of grace. Dare I say an epiphany. Thank you. Through your poetry, your stories, song, and your faith, we've encountered tonight those who suffer and are often kept invisible. You've helped us to understand. You've disrupted our hearts, our souls, and perhaps brought tears. You've also brought hope. Hope that we can be involved, that we can change. Hope of hospitality. Hope of fight back and reclaiming a narrative that's so deeply connected to our faith, to the Gospels, and to the biblical traditions. So thank you. And if we could just end with a prayer with you, Alison, and for you. Loving God, we thank you for the gift and witness of Alison. We thank you for what she has shared with us tonight. We ask that you anoint her anew with your Spirit, such that your life may be deepened within her. Amen. And to finish tonight, our session, we now invite everyone to say together, to say the Immigrants' Creed. The words will be on the screen, and in the background, you'll see the sculpture Angels Unawares, which was unveiled in St. Peter's Square to commemorate the 2019 World Day of Migrants and Refugees. For 2019, Pope Francis chose the theme, "It is not just about immigrants," to make sure no one remains excluded from society, whether a long-time resident or someone newly arrived. As we pray together, let us commit ourselves to building a society in which no one is excluded.
I believe in Almighty God, who guided his people in exile and exodus, the God of Joseph in Egypt and of Daniel in Babylon, the God of foreigners and immigrants.
I believe in Jesus Christ, a displaced Galilean, who was born away from his people and his home, who had to flee the country with his parents when his life was in danger, and who, upon returning to his own country, had to suffer the oppression of the tyrant Pontius Pilate, the servant of a foreign power. He was persecuted, beaten, and finally tortured, accused and condemned to death unjustly. But on the third day, this scorned Jesus rose from the dead, not as a foreigner, but to offer us citizenship in heaven.
I believe in the Holy Spirit, the eternal immigrant from God's kingdom among us, who speaks all languages, lives in all countries, and reunites all races. I believe that the Church is the secure home for all foreigners and believers who constitute it, who speak the same language and have the same purpose.
I believe that the communion of the saints begins when we accept the diversity of the saints. I believe in the forgiveness which makes us all equal. and in the reconciliation which identifies us more than does race, language, or nationality. I believe that in the resurrection, God will unite us as one people in which all are distinct and all are alike at the same time.
I believe in life eternal beyond this world, where no one will be an immigrant or undocumented, but all will be citizens of God's kingdom that has no end. Amen. Thank you everyone tonight, especially Alison, but thank you to all who've been here tonight. I just want to flag up that our journey continues next week with Danny Sweeney from the Justice and Peace Commission, who will talk to us about the work they're doing with refugees as well. Can I thank you? And as always, we welcome any feedback. If you have thoughts, reflections, and I'm sure you will as the week goes on, please email them to us and let us know what you're thinking and feeling, and we can take that feedback on. Meanwhile, enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.